This video is about people who got absolutely destroyed by confidence. Fake countries, fake fortunes, fake science, fake royalty, and lies so bold they fooled bankers, kings, scientists, and governments. These are not small scams. These are the greatest cons in history, pulled off because nobody wanted to ask one uncomfortable question. 1. Gregor MacGregor might be the patron saint of lying to rich people because he literally invented a country and sold tickets to it. In the 1820s, this Scottish guy returned to London claiming to be the Prince of Portuguese, a magical Central American land where the rivers basically flowed with champagne and gold chunks were lying on the ground waiting to be picked up. The British elite were so desperate to be trendy that they threw their life savings at him without even looking at a map. MacGregor packed shiploads of settlers off to this fantasy land, and when they arrived expecting grand palaces and opera houses, they found a muddy swamp and some confused locals. He made a fortune selling land deeds to a jungle that he didn't even own, proving that if you print a brochure on nice enough paper, people will buy a one-way ticket to absolutely nowhere. 2. We need to discuss the time the smartest people in Europe got outsmarted by a wooden box and a man with a cramp. In the late 18th century, the Mechanical Turk was unveiled as a chess-playing automaton that could defeat humans with cold machine logic. It beat Benjamin Franklin and Napoleon, convincing everyone that a bunch of gears had developed a soul and a strategy. The public gasped as the turban-wearing doll moved the pieces, completely missing the obvious fact that machines do not think. It turned out the groundbreaking technology was actually just a very small, very sweaty chess master folded up inside the cabinet like a pretzel, pulling levers and hoping he didn't have to sneeze. For 80 years, the world was fooled by a guy hiding in a cupboard, which says a lot about human observation skills. 3. If you ever worry that you are not qualified for your job, just look at the royal doctors of 18th century England who certified that a woman was a rabbit factory. In 1726, Mary Toft convinced the king's personal surgeon that she was miraculously giving birth to bunnies. Instead of questioning the laws of physics, these medical experts observed the event and wrote serious academic letters confirming it was a supernatural gift. They somehow ignored the obvious fact that Mary was just performing a very crude magic trick using pre-assembled animal parts she had hidden under her dress. The doctors were so eager to be part of a historic discovery that they suspended all logic and reason. When the hoax was finally revealed, the entire medical profession became the laughingstock of Europe, proving that having a fancy degree does not stop you from being completely outsmarted by a peasant with a plan. 4. If you think you are immune to scams, just remember the time a smooth-talking con man sold the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal. In 1925, Victor Lustig read a news article about the tower needing repairs and realized that people will believe anything if you whisper it in a secret meeting. He forged government credentials and invited the biggest scrap dealers in Paris to a luxury hotel, telling them the city was broke and quietly selling the landmark to the highest bidder. One dealer named André Poisson was so desperate to join the business elite that he paid a massive bribe plus the full sale price without asking a single follow-up question. When Poisson realized the tower was still standing and his money was gone, he was too humiliated to go to the police, allowing Lustig to escape to Austria and live like a king on the sheer stupidity of his victim. 5. Wilhelm Voigt proved that you don't need a weapon to take over a town. You just need a fancy coat and some confidence. In 1906, this unemployed shoemaker bought a used captain's uniform, walked onto a Berlin street, and started shouting orders at a squad of soldiers. Because the soldiers were trained to never question a hat with feathers on it, they followed him blindly. Voigt marched them to the town hall of Copenic, arrested the mayor for no reason, and confiscated the entire town treasury. He held the whole local government hostage for hours while everyone saluted him and brought him coffee. He eventually just hopped on a train with the cash, leaving the soldiers guarding an empty room and proving that authority is mostly just playing dress-up and acting like you belong there. 6. In 1917, a man named John R. Brinkley became the richest doctor in America by convincing men that the secret to eternal youth was hidden inside a goat. I am dead serious. Brinkley, who bought his medical degree for $500, claimed he could cure impotence and restore vitality by surgically implanting goat testicles into human scrotums. Thousands of men, including Hollywood stars and politicians, lined up to pay massive sums for this procedure. Brinkley used so many goats that he smelled like a barnyard, and he built the world's most powerful radio station just to broadcast his nonsense ads. He maimed hundreds of patients and made millions of dollars, proving that men will do literally anything, no matter how insane or dangerous, if you promise them it will fix their love life. 7. The BBC pulled off the greatest media prank of all time in 1957, and it proved that most people have no idea where their food comes from. On April Fool's Day, the respected news show Panorama aired a 3-minute segment about the bumper spaghetti harvest in Switzerland. The footage showed Swiss farmers picking strands of cooked spaghetti from trees and laying them in the sun to dry. Because spaghetti was considered an exotic food in Britain at the time, millions of viewers swallowed the lie whole. The BBC switchboard was jammed with people asking where they could buy their own spaghetti bush. The BBC hilariously told them to place a sprig of spaghetti in a tin of tomato sauce and hope for the best, exposing a nationwide lack of basic botanical knowledge. 8. The diamond necklace affair is the ultimate proof that a man will believe absolutely anything if he thinks a queen is flirting with him. A con artist named Jean de Valois decided to rob the rich by targeting Cardinal de Rohan, a guy who was desperate for royal attention. She convinced him that Marie Antoinette was secretly in love with him and needed him to buy a massive diamond necklace on her behalf. Jean even hired a random street worker who looked vaguely like the queen to meet the cardinal in a dark garden and hand him a rose. The cardinal was so blinded by his own ego that he handed over the necklace worth a fortune to the con artists. He honestly thought the Queen of France was sneaking around bushes to date him, while Jean was busy prying the diamonds loose and laughing all the way to the bank. 9. You have probably heard the phrase, "I have a bridge to sell you," but you might not know it comes from a guy who actually did it. George C. Parker was the boldest salesman in American history because he successfully sold the Brooklyn Bridge at least twice a week for years. He would set up a fake office near the landmark and target immigrants or tourists, showing them forged ownership papers with official-looking stamps. He convinced them they could set up toll booths and make a fortune charging people to cross. The scam was so effective that the New York police regularly had to stop confused buyers from physically erecting barriers in the middle of traffic. These poor guys would be waving their fake deeds at angry commuters, genuinely believing they owned a massive piece of public infrastructure just because a nice man in a suit took their cash. 10. The Great Diamond Hoax of 1872 proves that even the richest people in the world can be fooled by shiny rocks and a good story. Two prospectors named Philip Arnold and John Slack walked into a bank in San Francisco looking nervous and carrying a bag of uncut gems. They led a team of investors, including the founder of Tiffany & Company, to a secret location in the American West where diamonds were just lying in the dirt. The experts inspected the stones and valued the find at millions. In reality, the scammers had just bought cheap, industrial-grade diamonds in London and sprinkled them on an anthill in Wyoming like they were seasoning a steak. The investors were so blinded by greed that they didn't notice that diamonds, rubies, and emeralds do not naturally occur in the same geological formation. They bought the claim for a fortune, and the scammers vanished before anyone realized they had bought a salted dirt pile. 11. In 1869, a tobacconist named George Hull pulled off the greatest practical joke in archaeological history with the Cardiff giant. He hired men to carve a 10-foot statue out of gypsum, buried it on a farm in New York, and waited a year for workers to accidentally dig it up. The public went absolutely wild, believing it was a petrified ancient man from biblical times. Scientists and theologians argued for months about its origin, while Hull charged people 50 cents a head to stare at a block of stone. The best part is that showman P.T. Barnum tried to buy it, and when Hull refused, Barnum just built his own fake replica and claimed his was the real one. People paid to see Barnum's fake of the fake, proving that the public doesn't care about the truth as long as they can stand in line and look at something weird. 12. The Dreadnought hoax is the ultimate example of how a fancy uniform can turn off everyone's brain. In 1910, the British Royal Navy was the most powerful force on Earth. but they were humiliated by a group of artists and poets, including a young Virginia Woolf. The group darkened their skin with makeup, put on fake beards, and dressed in colorful robes to pose as the royal family of Abyssinia. They sent a fake telegram to the flagship HMS Dreadnought demanding a tour. The Navy didn't bother to check credentials. They rolled out the red carpet, fired a 21-gun salute, and gave them a full inspection of the top-secret vessel. The royals walked around mumbling total gibberish like bunga bunga, which the officers assumed was a foreign language. The Navy only realized they had saluted a bunch of bored pranksters in costumes when the story hit the newspapers the next day. 13. In 1925, a Portuguese chicken farmer named Alves dos Reis pulled off a scam so massive it almost destroyed his country's entire economy. He realized that counterfeiting money was too difficult, so he decided to just trick the official government printers into making real money for him. He forged a contract from the Bank of Portugal, authorizing the printing of millions of escudos, and sent it to a legitimate printing firm in London. The firm assumed everything was legit and shipped him crates of brand new, perfectly legal currency. Reis was suddenly richer than the bank itself, spending money so fast he caused inflation. He even tried to buy the actual Bank of Portugal just to hide the evidence of his crime, proving that if you act like you own the place, people will eventually just hand you the keys to the vault. 14. The British upper class in 1817 was so bored, they let a random servant girl play them like fiddles. A woman appeared in a small town speaking total gibberish and wearing a turban, and the locals immediately decided she must be royalty. She called herself Princess Caribou from an island in the Indian Ocean. A local man even pretended to understand her made-up language, translating her nonsense into epic stories about pirates and palaces. The gentry invited her to stay in their mansions, where she swam naked in lakes and climbed trees to pray to her gods. It was the perfect social season until someone recognized her as Mary Baker, a cobbler's daughter from down the road who was just tired of scrubbing floors. She proved that rich people will believe absolutely anything if it sounds exotic enough. 15. Cassie Chadwick was a woman who conquered the American banking system in 1904 by simply pretending to be related to a rich guy. She whispered to a lawyer that she was the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie, the steel tycoon who was basically the Elon Musk of his day. She never offered a DNA test or a letter from Carnegie. She just looked expensive and acted offended if anyone questioned her. Banks in Ohio started throwing money at her, loaning her millions based entirely on a rumor. She lived like a queen, buying diamond necklaces and gold pianos, while the bankers assumed Carnegie would foot the bill. When the truth came out, the banks were too embarrassed to admit they had loaned a fortune to a woman just because she dropped a famous name in a conversation. 16. In the 1920s, a former farmer named Oscar Hartzell convinced thousands of Americans that a dead pirate was going to make them billionaires. He claimed that the estate of Sir Francis Drake, the famous explorer who died in 1596, had never been paid out and was now worth billions with accumulated interest. Hartzell told victims that if they donated a small fee to help him fight the legal battle in London, they would get a massive share of the treasure. It was total nonsense, but 70,000 people sent him money every week. Hartzell lived a life of absolute luxury in London, while his victims back in America waited by their mailboxes for checks that were never coming, proving that greed can make people wait 300 years for a payday. 17. Han van Meegeren was an art forger who accidentally became a national hero by ripping off the Nazis. During World War II, he sold a lost painting by the master Vermeer to Hermann Göring for a record-breaking price. Göring, who considered himself a genius art collector, hung it in his house and bragged about it constantly. After the war, Meegeren was arrested for treason for selling national treasures to the enemy. To save his own neck, he had to prove the painting was a fake. He actually painted a brand new Vermeer right there in the courtroom in front of the judges. He proved that he hadn't sold a masterpiece to the Nazis. He had sold them a piece of junk he painted in his attic, making the German high command look like gullible fools. 18. In late 19th century Paris, a woman named Thérèse Humbert became the queen of the long con by simply owning a box that nobody was allowed to touch. She claimed she had inherited a massive fortune from an American millionaire, but legal complications meant the securities had to stay locked inside her fireproof safe until the lawsuits were settled. For 20 years, bankers, merchants, and creditors loaned her millions of francs just for the privilege of being in the same room as that safe. She lived in absolute luxury, bought castles, and threw lavish parties, all leveraging the contents of a box she refused to open. When the courts finally forced the lock in 1902, a crowd gathered expecting to see gold bars and bonds. Instead, they found a single brick and a trouser button. She had played a 20-year game of poker with the French financial system holding absolutely nothing in her hand, and she won every single round until the very end. 19. Louis Henricht might have been the greatest chemist of 1916, or just the greatest liar. He invited journalists and auto executives, including Henry Ford himself, to a demonstration where he claimed he could turn plain water into gasoline. He poured a small vial of secret green liquid into a bucket of water, stirred it, poured it into a car, and drove it around the block. The news exploded. Ford and others entered a bidding war to buy the formula, terrified it would ruin the oil industry. Henricht took the cash and stalled for time. It turned out he hadn't invented cheap fuel. He had just mixed the water with acetone, which can run an engine for a few minutes before destroying it completely. He sold a car-wrecking cocktail to the smartest car guys in the world. 20. If you think medical school is hard, just try not going at all and seeing what happens. Ferdinand de Mara, known as the Great Impostor, sweet-talked his way onto a Canadian Navy destroyer during the Korean War by pretending to be a trauma surgeon. He had zero medical training and had never stepped foot in a biology class. When 16 soldiers were brought in with critical combat injuries, de Mara didn't panic. He just ran to his cabin and speed-read a textbook on surgery like he was cramming for a history test. Miraculously, he operated on all of them without losing a single patient, proving that confidence is apparently just as good as a degree. He was only caught because his mother saw his picture in a newspaper as a war hero and asked why he was using a fake name. The Navy was so embarrassed that a random guy with a book was a better doctor than their actual staff that they just quietly let him go. 21. Jay Gould was one of the most ruthless robber barons in American history, a guy who chewed up competitors for breakfast, yet he got completely played by a man with a fake accent. In 1872, a con artist calling himself Lord Gordon Gordon arrived in New York claiming to be a Scottish aristocrat with enough money to buy the Erie Railroad. Gould was so desperate for control that he handed the Lord $1 million in stock as a gesture of good faith, without checking a single reference or asking to see a bank statement. Gordon Gordon immediately sold the stock and fled to Canada to live the high life. When Gould realized he had been hustled, he was so furious that he gathered a posse of thugs and tried to invade Canada to kidnap the guy back, creating an international diplomatic crisis over his own bruised ego. 22. Giuseppe Balsamo, better known as Count Cagliostro, was the 18th century's greatest salesman of absolute nonsense. He traveled the royal courts of Europe, claiming to be thousands of years old and possessing the secret elixir of eternal youth. He would roll into town with a flashy carriage and servants, selling potions that supposedly made wrinkles vanish and gray hair turn black. Aristocrats who were terrified of aging bought his Egyptian wine by the crate, ignoring the fact that the Count himself didn't look particularly young or healthy. He even started a secret society, charging huge membership fees to bored nobles who wanted to learn magic tricks. He was basically selling overpriced skincare and exclusivity to the wealthy, proving that rich people will pay any amount of money to avoid the reality that they are getting old just like the rest of us. 23. In 1911, the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre, but the real crime wasn't the theft itself. It was the genius scam behind it. A mastermind named Eduardo de Valfierno didn't actually want the painting. He just wanted the news coverage. Before the heist, he had a forger create 6 perfect copies of the masterpiece. Once the papers screamed that the Mona Lisa was gone, Valfierno secretly approached 6 different American millionaires and sold each one of them a stolen copy, claiming it was the original. Each buyer paid a fortune and hid their painting in a basement, too terrified to show anyone or ask for a certificate of authenticity. Valfierno made millions selling the same painting 6 times to 6 different idiots who couldn't even brag about their purchase, while the real Mona Lisa just sat in a trunk gathering dust. 24. You have to respect John Keely for keeping a straight face for 25 years while telling scientists that his engine ran on vibratory etheric force. In 1874, he unveiled the Keely motor, a machine that supposedly generated massive power from a few drops of water and a violin note. Investors, including the Astors, threw millions at him. Whenever they asked for a demonstration, Keely would play a tune on his violin, the machine would shake, and everyone would clap like seals. He lived in luxury for decades on their money without ever producing a single product. After he died, engineers tore up his floorboards and found a giant sphere of compressed air connected to the machine by hidden tubes. He hadn't discovered a new energy source. He had just discovered that rich people will pay anything if you use enough buzzwords. 25. The Tichborne claimant case proves that a mother's love can be completely blind to reality. In 1866, a coarse, overweight butcher from Australia named Arthur Orton showed up in England claiming to be the long-lost heir to the wealthy Tichborne family. The real heir, Roger, was skinny, refined, and spoke fluent French. Orton was huge, uneducated, and didn't know a single word of French. Despite the fact that he looked nothing like her son and couldn't remember basic details of his own life, Lady Tichborne immediately accepted him and gave him a massive allowance. The rest of the family had to spend vast fortunes in court to prove that this butcher wasn't their relative, while the British public cheered for Orton just because they loved the idea of a fat Australian guy stealing a fortune from snobs. 26. Jefferson Soapy. Smith was a con man in the Wild West who proved that people are bad at math and even worse at gambling. He would set up a stand on a busy street corner and sell ordinary bars of soap for $5, which was a day's wages back then. The hook was that he would wrap $100 bills inside the wrappers of a few lucky bars in front of the crowd. He would mix them into the pile, and his secret accomplices would immediately buy a bar and scream that they had won the money. The crowd would go into a frenzy, fighting each other to buy expensive soap that contained absolutely nothing. Smith sold mountains of useless soap to miners and cowboys who walked away clean but completely broke, never realizing the winners were on his payroll. 27. Before cryptocurrency scams, there was Charles Ponzi, a man who didn't even bother to come up with a product. In 1920, he promised investors a 50% return on their money in just 90 days by supposedly trading international postal reply coupons. It sounded boring enough to be true, so people started mortgaging their houses to give him cash. Ponzi didn't buy a single coupon. He just took money from the new investors to pay off the old ones and pocketed the rest. He made millions in months, bought a mansion with air conditioning, and was hailed as a financial wizard. When the math finally fell apart and the scheme collapsed, it turned out he had enough cash to cover less than 30% of the investments, leaving thousands of Bostonians with empty pockets and a very expensive lesson in economics. 28. Arthur Ferguson stands out as the greatest salesman of things he did not own, mostly because he realized American tourists would buy absolutely anything. In the 1920s, this Scottish actor spotted a rich American admiring Nelson's column in London. Ferguson whispered that the British government was broke and secretly selling the monument. The American wrote a check for £6,000 on the spot. Emboldened, Ferguson went on to sell Big Ben to another tourist for a down payment of £1,000, and he even accepted a deposit for Buckingham Palace. He eventually moved to Washington, D.C., where he managed to rent the White House to a wealthy rancher for $100,000 a year, proving that if you have a charming accent and a straight face, you can sell public property to the public. 29. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes, the most logical detective in fiction, yet he was personally outsmarted by 2 schoolgirls with a pair of scissors. In 1917, cousins Elsie and Frances took photos in their garden showing them playing with winged fairies. The fairies were clearly paper cutouts from a children's magazine held up by hat pins. You could even see the pinheads in the photos. But Conan Doyle was so desperate to believe in magic that he declared them genuine evidence of the supernatural. He wrote an entire book, The Coming of the Fairies, staking his reputation on the honesty of two kids who were just having a laugh. It took 60 years for the girls to finally admit they had fooled one of the world's greatest literary minds with some cardboard and a Kodak camera. 30. William Henry Ireland was a teenager in the 1790s who made the literary experts of London look like absolute clowns. Working in a law firm, he started forging documents claiming they were signed by William Shakespeare. When he saw how excited people got, he decided to go big and wrote an entire fake play titled Vortigern, claiming it was a lost masterpiece by the bard. The experts analyzed the ink and paper and declared it a work of genius, superior even to Hamlet. The play premiered at a major theater to a sold-out crowd. However, the play was so terrible and boring that the audience started laughing in the middle of the second act. Ireland eventually confessed he wrote it himself, proving that the experts were more in love with the celebrity name than the actual quality of the writing. 31. Science is supposed to be about cold, hard facts, but the Piltdown Man proved that scientists are just as gullible as toddlers. In 1912, an amateur archaeologist claimed to find the missing link between apes and humans in a gravel pit in England. The experts examined the skull and declared it a monumental discovery of human evolution. For 40 years, textbooks were rewritten and museums displayed this thing as a national treasure. It wasn't until 1953 that someone actually looked closely and realized it was just a medieval human skull, fitted with the jawbone of a modern orangutan. The teeth had literally been filed down with a metal file to look human, and the bones were stained with tea to look old. The entire scientific community had spent 4 decades worshipping a bad art project made by a prankster with a chemistry set. 32. Joseph Yellowkid. Weil was the Hollywood director of con artist because he didn't just tell a lie, he built a movie set. In the early 20th century, he wanted to scam a wealthy man out of a fortune, so he rented an empty commercial building in Chicago. He hired dozens of unemployed actors to pretend to be tellers, security guards, and busy customers. He set up a completely fake bank with brass cages and bags of fake money. When the victim walked in, he saw a bustling, legitimate financial institution. He handed over his cash to Weil, thinking he was making a deposit. The moment the guy left, Weil gave a signal, and the entire cast packed up the furniture and vanished. When the victim came back an hour later, he found an empty room with a "for lease" sign, wondering if he had hallucinated the entire bank. 33. P.T. Barnum is the father of show business, but his famous Fiji mermaid exhibit was the ultimate lesson in lowering your expectations. In the 1840s, Barnum plastered New York with posters of a stunning, bare-chested siren with long, flowing hair swimming in the ocean. Thousands of people lined up for blocks expecting to see a real-life Ariel. But once they paid their entry fee and rushed inside, they didn't find a beautiful sea goddess. Instead, they found a dusty, brown, crusty-looking thing in a glass case that stood about 2 feet tall and looked more like a forgotten science project than a mythical creature. It was just a clumsy piece of taxidermy with a face that only a mother could love. The crowd instantly realized they had been played, but Barnum knew that they were too embarrassed to admit they paid good money to stare at a fake doll, so they just left quietly and let the next group of suckers come in. 34. The stock exchange fraud of 1814 is a perfect example of how fake news can destroy an economy in an afternoon. During the Napoleonic Wars, a man dressed in a flashy red military uniform burst into the town of Dover, shouting that the war was over and the enemy had been defeated. He didn't have any official papers, just a loud voice and a confident attitude. The rumor traveled to London faster than a lightning bolt, causing the stock market to go absolutely crazy with optimism. While everyone was celebrating, a politician named Lord Cochrane quietly sold his massive collection of government bonds at peak prices. He made a fortune before the real news arrived that the war was definitely not over. The entire financial system of the British Empire was manipulated by a guy playing dress-up and yelling enthusiastically. 35. Cyril Hoskin was a quiet plumber from rural England who decided that fixing pipes was too boring, so he reinvented himself as a mystical Tibetan monk. In the 1950s, he released a book called The Third Eye, under the name T. Lobsangrampa. He claimed to have undergone secret ancient rituals in the Himalayas that gave him psychic powers and allowed him to see invisible auras. The book became a global sensation, and spiritual seekers worshipped him as a guru. The problem was, Cyril had never stepped foot in Tibet. He barely ever left his garden. He wrote the entire thing based on travel books he borrowed from the local library. When reporters finally exposed him as a plumber eating toast in his bathrobe, he calmly told his fans that a monk's spirit had simply moved into his body, and thousands of people actually kept believing him. 36. You might think you are good at sales, but have you ever sold the Taj Mahal? Because a man named Natwarlal did it 3 times. This legendary Indian con artist would pose as a high-ranking government official and find wealthy foreign tourists who were looking for unique souvenirs. He would convince them that the Indian government was broke and auctioning off national monuments to private buyers. He drafted official-looking deeds and sold the Taj Mahal, the Red Fort, and even the Parliament House to gullible businessmen. The funniest part is that when he sold the Parliament, he told the buyers that the purchase included the politicians currently sitting inside as part of the property. He was sentenced to over 100 years in prison but managed to escape repeatedly, becoming a folk hero for his sheer audacity. 37. In 1844, the New York Sun published a breaking news story that made the entire city look up at the sky in confusion. The headline screamed that a man named Monk Mason had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in just 3 days using a sophisticated steering balloon. The article was filled with technical jargon and breathless descriptions of the crew seeing the ocean from above. People rushed into the streets, fighting to buy copies of the paper and staring at the clouds trying to spot the returning airship. It was the 19th century equivalent of a viral internet post. In reality, the entire story was a work of fiction written by Edgar Allan Poe to make some quick cash. There was no balloon, no voyage, and no steering mechanism. The public was furious when they realized they had been tricked by a poet with a vivid imagination. 38. George Salmanazar was a blonde French teenager in the early 1700s who decided that being French was boring, so he became the world's first professional fake Asian. He arrived in London claiming to be a native of Formosa, which is modern-day Taiwan. He had never been east of Paris, but that didn't stop him. He wrote a best-selling book describing how Formosans lived in golden tents and ate raw meat for breakfast. He even invented an entire alphabet of gibberish symbols and taught classes on the Formosan language at Oxford University. The most brilliant professors in England sat in lecture halls taking serious notes on a language that George was literally making up as he stood at the chalkboard. He proved that if you speak confidently enough, you can teach a room full of geniuses absolutely nothing. 39. Titanic Thompson was a legendary gambler who taught the world that the best way to win a bet is to cheat before the game even starts. In the 1920s, he bet a group of high rollers a massive pile of cash that a specific highway sign was exactly 20 miles from the city limits. The gamblers took the bet, thinking he was just guessing. Thompson won instantly. What the victims didn't know was that Thompson had driven out to the highway the night before with a shovel, dug up the sign, and moved it 5 miles down the road just to make his math correct. He once bet he could throw a walnut over a hotel roof, but he swapped the walnut for a hollow shell filled with lead. He wasn't lucky. He was just the hardest working cheater in history. 40. Stanley Clifford Wayman was a man who conquered the United States just by walking into rooms like he owned them. In 1921, he saw an Afghan princess looking confused at a train station in Washington, D.C. He was wearing a random naval uniform he bought at a thrift store, so he walked up and introduced himself as a State Department liaison. He hailed a taxi and led her straight into the White House. He marched past security, introduced the princess to President Warren G. Harding, and even posed for official photos with them. Nobody checked his ID. The president assumed he was with the princess assumed he was with the president, and Wayman just stood there smiling. He spent his whole life impersonating doctors and generals, proving that a nice suit is the ultimate security pass. 41. For 60 years, the world was obsessed with a woman named Anna Anderson, who claimed to be Grand Duchess Anastasia, the daughter of the Russian Tsar. She said she survived the revolution and was a lost princess. European royalty was divided, with many rich supporters giving her money and letting her live in their castles. But there was one massive, glaring problem that everyone conveniently ignored. The Russian princess couldn't speak a single word of Russian. She only spoke German. Yet people wanted the fairy tale to be true so badly that they hired translators to help her talk to her own alleged relatives. DNA tests later proved she was actually a Polish factory worker, proving that people will ignore reality if the lie is more romantic. 42. Harry Gergeson was an orphan from Illinois who realized that Americans love royalty, so he reinvented himself as a prince. He moved to Hollywood in the 1930s, opened a fancy restaurant, and lived like a king under the name Michael Romanoff. He dined with Frank Sinatra and Humphrey Bogart, telling stories about his royal childhood. The funniest part is that everyone in Hollywood knew he was a fake. He didn't look Russian, he didn't sound Russian, and he was born in the Midwest. But he was such a charming host and picked up the check so often that nobody cared. He became a beloved celebrity solely because he had the audacity to call himself a prince, proving that in show business, the truth is just an optional accessory. 43. In 1971, a writer named Clifford Irving almost pulled off the literary heist of the century by betting on a billionaire's silence. He announced that he had been chosen to write the autobiography of Howard Hughes, the eccentric recluse who hadn't been seen in public for years. Irving figured Hughes was too weird and private to ever come out and deny it. A major publisher gave Irving a check for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Irving forged letters, faked interviews, and was about to release the book when the real Howard Hughes finally got so annoyed that he organized a telephone conference with reporters just to say, "I don't know who this guy is, but he is lying." It took a billionaire coming back from the social dead to stop the press. 44. We end with Colonel Thomas Blood, the only man in history to steal the crown jewels and get a pension for it. In 1671, this Irish rebel befriended the keeper of the Tower of London, knocked him out, and flattened the royal crown with a mallet so he could stuff it down his pants. He was caught running away with the crown and the scepter. But when he was brought before King Charles II in chains, Blood was so charismatic, funny, and bold that the king couldn't stop laughing. Instead of sending him to prison, the king gave him a full pardon and a generous yearly salary to live in Ireland. He proved that if your crime is audacious enough and your jokes are good enough, even the king might just become your fan. After everything you just heard, be honest. Which scam should have been in this video but wasn't? Not the famous one, the one you know, the one you fell for, or the one everyone still believes today. Drop it in the comments and explain why people keep buying it. Like the video if it made you uneasy. Subscribe if you enjoy watching confidence beat common sense.